Today I want to preach on the first reading that was taken from the first letter to the Corinthians. And I think we can only truly appreciate this first reading when we put it in contrast with another moment of the life of St. Paul when he preached in Athens. These are like two very different styles of preaching. Maybe you remember when he went to Athens and he preached to the wise people from Greece. He preached to the philosophers in the Areopagus. What was his style of preaching in Athens? He intended to gain the audience. He intended to be wise. He intended to be astute, speaking to the philosophers in their own language. So in Athens, Paul intended to preach in a way that he could connect with the philosophers and the Gentiles. What was the result of this preaching? Failure. The text of the Acts of the Apostles says that only Damaris, Dionysius, and a very small group converted from his preaching. Paul learned from this experience. And after preaching to the people in Athens, he writes the letter to the Corinthians. And the style is very different. He doesn't intend to be smart or astute or to win over his audience. He preaches in a very raw style. And he says, I don't want to preach with human eloquence anymore. He had learned his experience from Athens. He says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, preaching preaching in this new style, and I know this is going to be foolishness to the Gentiles. So completely different style in his preaching to the Corinthians. So what can we learn from this two different styles of his preaching? The first lesson I think is very interesting. Even the saints don't get everything right all the time. Paul failed his first time that he preached in Athens, but he learned the lesson. So I think it's comforting for us sinners to be reminded that the saints also failed. And the saints sometimes made wrong decisions. In the same way that Paul messed up in Athens, we can also mess up. Because holiness doesn't mean that you get everything right all the time. Perfection doesn't mean that you never commit any mistakes. Perfection means perfection in charity. So that's the first lesson. But I'd say that the second lesson that hopefully is equally useful for our lives is that the effectiveness of a preaching is measured in the amount of conversions. And conversion only happens when we preach the cross of our Lord. So today, brothers and sisters, let us be reminded as we start the reading of the letter of Paul to the Corinthians that we are all entitled to commit mistakes. And that holiness doesn't mean that we never commit mistakes, but that we're still striving for perfection in charity. And that true conversions only happen when the cross of Christ is preached.